you know, we still need the stories, whether we read modern novels or not. It's like, we need that connection, whether it's with our elders or with our kids. We pass these stories on as something precious. For me personally, it's probably just the unknown. I've always been drawn more to the unknown and whatever the beyond of normal life. So I would actually go out and look for these. We would go to haunted houses. We would go to haunted areas of the cities, see what was going on. Yeah. Now, whatever that comes from, I don't know, but it kept life interesting.
It was almost like an escape.
Definitely an escape. Family life was not a happy life, so that was an escape. Oh, definitely.
Hey, welcome to the Floaties for Krakens podcast. I am your host, Camille Maria Costa, and it is a brilliant day to be monstrous. Hi, Cuddlefish. Welcome back to Season 2, Episode 11 of the Floaties for Krakens podcast. Hi, how are we doing? I hope we're doing good. And if we're not doing good, that's also completely fine. We can be doing okay. But strive to be kind to yourself today and drink your water and eat a good snack and watch a really good comfort show because you deserve it. But yeah, hi. Hello. If you could peep right over here, this beautiful work of art. If you weren't able to tune into our last episode, let's just say this is everything to me right now. This beautiful stitch work was done by our last episode's guest, Maddie Howard. He is an amazing human being and an amazing artist. Go check out Figure One Oddities. I'm always going to promote it. But yeah, I'm actually, to be transparent, figuring out what's going to be a good opening spot. What should be Camille's intro spot to have some consistency in the show. And I'm liking this so far. This is an ofrenda for people that may not know. It's basically an offering or an altar that is very common in Mexican and Mexican American cultures, where we put photos of our loved ones that have passed on. But also, as you can see, there's cute trinkets that something just fell, which means maybe a loved one is here. Great. Hi. Hello. I know you Floaties guests really love spooky stuff. Yeah. Sometimes people don't know this, but sometimes the lights on the ofrenda will just turn on every now and again, and we like to just think, maybe someone's visiting. So yeah, we try to keep it a safe space, as you can see. But yeah. Now our Kraken is here forever, and I think our ancestors would be really proud of it, to say the least. But anyway, yeah. So we're gonna try out this spot for a bit. I think I like it. What do you all think? I feel like it represents me and my home. So yeah. Anyway, shall we get to the episode? That would probably help, wouldn't it? Today's episode, of course, is nothing short of amazing. Nothing short of just beautiful and so knowledge-filled. And I felt like after this episode, my mind was racing in all the best ways. Just of thinking of concepts and ideas and monsters and just when you have those really good, fruitful conversations that challenge you and make you think and make your brain hurt, but in the best way, that's what this episode is. And it's with an amazing person. This person is the definition of just kind, compassionate, just always looking out for other people. And I'm excited for y'all to meet them today. So let me introduce Allison Kate. Allison Kate is an independent folklorist based in her hometown of Nashville, Tennessee. She holds a master's degree in folk studies from Western Kentucky University and a BA in cultural anthropology and international studies from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. For her master's thesis, which was incredible, Allison had the privilege of writing about the Tomato Crew, which is the parading group she joins each year for East Nashville's Tomato Arts Festival. Her research interests include festivals, local legends, and the role of the arts in community-led placemaking practices. She is also interested in the intersections of folklore and film, but of course, most especially, horror. In her spare time, Allison and her husband are probably on a walk with their German Shepherd mix, Snoopy. You all are gonna fall in love with Allison, truly. We first met in our master's degree program at Western Kentucky University, Folk Studies, and I was always so blown away by how brilliant her conversations and like her discussions in class were. They were always so compelling and so bright, and I don't think she fathoms or even comprehends or understands how brilliant she is. So everybody let her know in the comments, please. She's stellar. She's just such an incredible human being and a brilliant scholar. And the conversations we had today were immaculate, were just so amazing. And, before I go any further too, I should say this episode is a long one, and this episode is hard. It's a difficult episode. There are a lot of topics in here that are discussed that are difficult for many people to kind of sit through or listen to and can be triggering because of this specific character, this monster. There will be discussions of those who have been enslaved, of slavery in historical times, of the racial injustice in the US and racial injustice in the world at large, racist acts, abuse, the taking of one's own life. This is a complicated episode, but an episode that strikes so much important discussion, I think. And this character, this monster, deserves to be listened to. So, yeah, take with that what you will. Protect yourself, pace yourself if you need to. Or if you can't listen, that's okay too. But I could think of no one better to speak so kindly and beautifully about this monster than Allison. So yeah, without further ado, ladies and cuttlefish, let me introduce to you Justice for Candymen. Well, hi again, Allison.
Hi, Camille.
It's always funny saying hi twice to you all.
I know that's
but it's what we have to do.
Yes, it's appreciated too.
Good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm good.
Yeah. Did you just come back from work right now?
I did. So please forgive me if I'm a little tired, but yes, I'm just excited.
Every emotion is accepted here, whatever part of the day you're in. We've interviewed at all different times of day, so it's okay. We appreciate that we actually got you on. So I'm so excited.
I'm just grateful to be here.
Oh, gosh. For those of you that may not know, I first met Allison when we were in grad school together.
Yeah.
Allison was 1 year below me, and I was so sad because, well, for a lot of reasons. I think our grad school experience was pretty tough.
Yeah.
We had to do grad school during the pandemic, which was not ideal, I think, for anybody. So it was hard. It was a hard time, but I just have to say, before we get into this, I literally, and I should have brought it with me, but when I defended my thesis in 2021, Allison sent me the most adorable, beautiful gift box that I have ever received in my freaking life, and it was La Llorona themed. And the candle, I refused to burn the end of it. I have it in my. I should have brought it. I'll get it right now. But it smells so good. She supported small businesses. It's like it's literally the nicest thing anybody has ever done for me. Just so you all know the type of person that Allison is. A freaking superstar, sunshine. Like that is who Allison is as a person.
Well, I would also like to note that the first time we met, you and Ellie gave my tour for Western. And it was the best introduction I could have gotten. So I was like touring the program as a prospective student. And so you and Ellie got a workout walking me up and down the very hilly Western campus. And it was the best introduction I could have ever gotten and made me feel like this was a good place to be. So I'm just
so glad.
I'm so grateful for your friendship and just to know you. And
me too.
And I love learning about your research, and I loved learning about La Llorona while you were in the process of doing interviews and working on your thesis. Just love it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It means so much. I think, especially when you're able to, like, I think geeking out about these things, like with a fellow folklorist that's like been through it and also gets the same anxieties that we do as a young folklorist, or like just like as people balancing these complicated worlds. Like, I don't know. It's just so much fun to geek about these things with people that get it.
Yeah. No,
so
truly.
I'm so thankful for you. You're a gem. And I'm so excited for people to hear about you. And she's literally brilliant, everybody. Like, I'm just so excited. I'm so pumped.
Thank you.
But enough about me. Please, Allison, tell everybody who you are, what you do, what you're passionate about, all the things.
So my name is Allison. And as we just mentioned, I also got my master's degree in folk studies from Western Kentucky University. And I was a year below Camille. And I did my thesis on the Tomato Art Festival here in East Nashville. So I am from Nashville. And so my thesis was about this festival that happens in the East Nashville neighborhood every August. And we just had our 20th annual festival this past year. And it was really, really gracious. I, like you, interviewed my family and friends for this thesis because I participate every year in the Tomato Art Festival parade with my in-laws and their group of friends. So I got to chat to them about, the process of baking floats and how they understand this festival and its creative expressions as emblematic of East Nashville identity. And it was tough, but it was a fantastic experience. And so other than that, I got my bachelor's degree from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. It was a double major in cultural anthropology and international studies. And I just told Camille that I joke that I am moonlighting as a folklorist because I still live in East Nashville and I'm still definitely doing work regarding the Tomato Festival. My work with that I don't believe is done. And so there are also all sorts of interesting folklore things that go on in this neighborhood that that hopefully I can turn into a product one day. We'll see. But that's a little bit about me.
Yeah. Amazing. Yes, I love your thesis. I think it is so, I had never heard of the Tomato Festival ever before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you captured the human nature of like the importance of why everyone gathers there, right, every year.
Yeah.
And why just because I mean, of course, like your work on the idea of the festival and like the traditions and the rituals are so important, but I love the human part that you brought to your work, as you always do. It was so lovely. And I know it was hard, as you said. I know it was complicated. I know interviewing people it's hard, especially family. It's a tough thing. so amazing. So proud of you. Always so proud of you. It was such good work. Such good work.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. So then, I know we're talking about tomatoes and festivals and that, version of folklore, but I'm
Mhm.
curious. I know you like the spooky.
I do.
When did you begin to like the spooky, or when were you first introduced to it?
I did not like it to begin with. My introduction to the spooky was really bumpy.
Yeah.
The first encounter I can remember is when I was really, really little. My mom loved the old black and white Universal horror monster movies.
Yep.
So if Bela Lugosi was in it, she would watch it. She loved those movies, and
What
so
a gem, also, Bela Lugosi.
yes, yeah, absolutely. Um, so I guess yeah, it was. She was watching the 1941 film The Wolfman, which has Bela Lugosi in it and Lon Chaney Jr. And
Right.
it's a great movie to watch as an adult, but for a kid, it was like because it's a werewolf movie.
Yeah.
In fact, I think if I'm not mistaken, it's the first werewolf movie.
I think you're
And
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
so it kind of set the conventions for like what popular culture perceptions of werewolves are.
Right.
And it absolutely terrified me. And I think my dad kind of chastised my mom, if I'm remembering correctly, for letting me watch it. My mom was like, it's in black and white. Like, the special effects are so bad. I didn't think that she'd find it scary. But it gave me nightmares well into my teens.
Of course it did.
Yeah, for sure. It was.
It's frightening. It
It
is a frightening
is.
film.
It is. And it's also very, as when you're an adult watching it and have like an adult's perspective and maturity can handle that sort of thing. Uh, it's also a beautiful and tragic film as well.
Hmm.
But yeah, when I was a kid, it really just scared me so bad.
Yeah.
And so werewolves and wolves, just as a general concept, became the thing as a kid that I was really freaked out by.
Yeah.
And the story that I tell myself about myself is is that the reason that that could possibly be is that we always had dogs. We're a big dog family,
Yeah.
and there are few things in this world more precious to us besides people than our critters, than our dogs.
Absolutely. All
So
day, every day.
right. So and that remains true, but to
Yeah.
me it seemed like the werewolf was just kind of like this bastardization of something that I had loved so much, and that was really
Mm.
scary. This really like this thing that I loved so much becoming so like terrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah, this like canine creature that had the
Yes.
capacity to inflict harm was very scary.
Oh my gosh. Absolutely. I guess I never really thought about it that way.
Yeah.
But, as children, you're barely learning the language in
Yeah.
general, but I think what it means to feel things and have emotions, and you're learning to love things for the first time so deeply like you do your pets.
Yeah.
So watching the inverse of that
Yeah.
can be quite traumatizing.
That's such a good point. Yeah, for sure.
No
Yeah.
matter what black and white or what
No.
special effects, CGI. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, or lack thereof, which I mean, for the time, the special effects were really quite impressive, and
Oh,
as a
yeah.
kid, it totally convinced me. So
Right,
yeah,
right. Absolutely. Just as scary.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I really, really tried to stay away from like I would never like of my own volition watch a horror movie for a
Right.
long, long time. Horror was not my thing. I wanted to stay away from it as much as possible because I did not like how it made me feel from that
Yeah.
very early experience. And then it really wasn't until college that I dipped my toe back into it.
Yeah.
And my husband deserves credit for that.
Yay.
So yeah, so my husband and I, we went to different colleges for undergrad. So we did a long-term relationship while we were in undergrad, but
Right.
we would always in between classes talk to each other on the phone, and we would just like talk to
Yeah.
each other about our classes. And he was a film major, and there was one semester where he must have been taking a horror class, and he would be talking about the ideas and how certain the capacity for horror as a genre, just not just in film, but horror as a
Yeah.
genre, in literature and film, and and like folktales too,
Yeah.
to comment on the human experience, and especially its capacity to comment on like historical injustices and societal ills and things like that, in a way, in a really unique way. So
Yes.
I started back because of those conversations, that and those as I came to understand, that this is a, as a genre, it's uniquely disposed to offer critique and commentary. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Well, shout out to your husband,
Yeah, for sure.
for one.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad that that is kind of the vehicle, um, that brought like this world of horror to you in a positive way.
Hmm.
Because, and and I could die on this hill. I'm always one of those people that think horror writers, filmmakers, producers, musicians, whatever, right, whatever art form that you create horror with, deserve so much more recognition and respect,
Hmm.
in Hollywood, just in the public eye, because I hate how people think less of a film. For example, they're like, oh, it's not serious, like it's a horror film, the acting is probably not good, the writing is
Hmm.
probably not good, it's all for show, blah blah blah. I think that is a absolute disgrace. I hate when people say that. Which is why I think they've created like completely separate awards shows just for horror and horror fans alike.
Yeah, for sure.
um, but it'll never cease to amaze me why people don't take them seriously.
Hmm.
And I love what you said. Like, for many cultures and communities, the only ways they can talk about very complex topics and be taken seriously about them, ironically enough, is
Hmm.
through horror. For centuries, it's not even just now. Like, always, as you mentioned, with folk tales, right, legend telling, all of these things. um it's that's my favorite thing about it.
Yeah,
That's the best part of it, of it all.
totally agree.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's so cool. Was there anything that your husband introduced to you, and that could be film wise, story wise, anything, that like you really grew to like, or like really grew to love a lot?
Mm. Because there's lots of course, different subgenres in horror, and not all I care for. Body horror for me is very difficult to watch.
Me too.
Yeah, he enjoys it, but it's and it's not that. Of course, there have been movies where, especially in the period of like the 70s and 80s, there became a lot of horror movies with no like, of course they all say something about where society is, where that film or that piece of art is able to be made,
Yeah,
but they weren't particularly like commenting on a whole lot. There's this period in film, especially with like slashers and body horror, where it represented a really like kind of re- conservative notions on
sure.
society and people's place
Yes.
in it, and sex in particular. I'm thinking about Friday
Mm,
the 13th, which is where the horror trope becomes like, if a kid has sex in a film, or someone has sex in the film, then they'll be the one to die,
right.
because that was
Right.
the whole function of the first Friday the 13th film.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
but so not all of these films, comment on society in a certain way. It could be reflective of it, but not all of them
Totally.
offer comments. The I'll tell you, the very first movie that the very first movie that I went to see with Will, my very first horror movie that I ever saw in the theaters was The Witch. Yeah, no, it was, and
Wow.
I thought I was going to run out of the theater because
Oh my gosh.
it was too much. It was so much to handle.
I
And
haven't even seen it yet.
it's
Yeah.
it's a lot. It's
It's
a
what I
lot.
hear from
Just
every
yeah,
person.
not that it's not worth watching, it's just that visually, it's very intense, and thematically, it's incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think I read an interview with the writer director, where he said, it's like, uh, all the fears of the Puritan world at that time, and what if they were right?
Mm,
What if their
mm,
entire worldview was correct? Um,
mm.
and
Yeah.
yeah, so it's not that it's a good movie. I don't think I've watched it in its entirety since we saw it in the movie,
That's fair.
or
Yeah.
since we saw it in the theater. So yeah, it's been a journey, but the films that I tend to gravitate toward tend to be the ones through which people offer critiques of society, or maybe reflect on, you know, a historic injustice. Um,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
for my first AFS presentation, which was also weird because again it was virtual, it was during the pandemic. So let me think.
Also weird. Yes.
Yeah, it would have been 2021, right? I don't remember.
Yeah.
But I know that you were there because you messaged me
I just
after.
100. Oh,
But
absolutely, I was. Are you kidding? Yes.
yeah, but
Mm-hmm.
the I did my presentation. I obviously, if you can't tell by this conversation, the intersection of film and folklore is very interesting to me.
Oh
So
yeah.
I
Absolutely.
I did my AFS presentation on a Polish horror film called Demon, and I believe it came out in 2016, if I'm not
20.
mistaken.
Yeah, like 20. Yeah, I think you're at 2015. Something recent.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's about it's what it is. We don't have to go too deep into it, but what it's about is
Please do. It's so good. It's wildly good. Yeah.
it's there's a whole genre of like of contemporary Polish literature and film that comments on the Poland's role in the Holocaust. So there's a prevailing, and sometimes, you know, nationally, like on like a nationalism level, sort of enforced narrative that, you know, of course, Poles were also victims of World War II,
Mm,
and the the prevailing acceptable narrative is that, you know, the Holocaust was perpetrated by the Nazis, but violence against Jews was not a Polish thing.
mm,
When there have been some clearly documented historical instances of, yes, there were, you know, non-Jewish Poles that perpetrated violence against Polish Jews during the
right.
Holocaust, but
Right.
several artists, filmmakers, writers have been addressing this, like the taking some sort of responsibility and acknowledgement of Polish participation in the Holocaust and violence
Mm-hmm.
against Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's been happening, and of course, it's subverting like this like wider narrative.
Right.
Um, so the film Demon uses the Dibuk, which is a figure from Jewish folklore, to comment on like Holocaust denial, like the role of like the denial of Poles' role in the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's what the film basically is, and it's interesting because it's made by non-Jewish Poles. So non-Jewish Polish artists have taken this Jewish folklore entity and use it to comment on the history of this nation. So that's interesting.
It is very fascinating. So fascinating. And your research on it was so lovely and so well done. And it's so funny because I remember when you very first I remember you did a paper on it
Yeah,
and you did
that's
a
right.
presentation for us.
Yeah.
And I hadn't heard about the film before, I hadn't seen it. And then I had traveled home with my family and my brother was visiting. Ironically enough, he's like, "Look, I found this cool film online. Does anybody want to watch it?" And I was like, "Sure." And then they were like, "It's called Demon," and I was like, "Okay." So then it started playing immediately. I was like, "Oh my god, this is
Aww.
Allison. This is Allison's research." Oh my gosh, it was wild. It was so wild.
Yeah. That's so funny that it just kind of came into your life after that. I love
Yeah,
that.
it was meant to be. It was meant to be.
But
What did you think about it?
it was terrifying for one.
Yeah.
Terrifying. I thought the way that it was shot was so. Now that I know too, like, the commentary it was hoping to have,
Yeah.
of course puts a. And I was looking at it through that lens, so of course I already knew what you were talking about, like,
Yeah.
beforehand. It was so haunting. I think that is the best word that I could
Mhm.
use for it.
Yeah.
Um, it was jarring. It's in a different language, obviously,
Yeah.
which I think is incredible. But it was haunting,
Mhm.
and there was so much, I think, folklore, obviously,
Yeah.
throughout the entire film that you could just pull out.
Certainly.
That was so fascinating. I don't
Mhm.
know. It was interesting. It was
Yeah.
it was scary.
Yeah. It's one
It
of
was a
my
scary
favorite
film.
films, but so I'm
It's so
glad I'm
good.
glad you liked it and had a good experience with it.
I did. I loved it. I mean, and maybe I'm just a sucker for learning about like cultural wedding practices too. I think they're fun to
Same,
see,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah,
And like the
for sure.
dancing and the food or whatever, like what
Yeah,
what are the traditions, the rituals,
the rituals, yeah.
and that specific entity. I mean, I think it was so brilliant to talk about those things.
Yeah.
I don't know. It was good. It was
Mhm.
really good. We can link that down below
Yeah,
if
for
anybody
sure.
wants to watch
Yes,
it.
definitely.
So good. So good. Um, okay. Well, with that in mind, I'm very, very, very excited to ask you,
Mhm.
Allison, what do you think is a monster?
Oh, okay. So I've thought about this a lot because I your other guests have given such incredible answers, and I
Oh.
can't just say ditto
You
to all
can.
of their.
It's
No,
okay.
there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit of that in there, but just I hope you don't mind. I wrote it down just so I could like
Oh, of
have like a
course not.
just to keep
Yes.
just to have everything like coherent. But
Please do.
so to me, there's two parts to what makes something a monster, and
Okay.
the first one is that it's something unnatural. So something that's understood as transgressing or existing outside of the boundaries of what is understood to be normal.
Mm.
And that's what I kind of love about the quote that Dr. Horrigan pulled in her episode about
Yes.
the monstrous is something, it is a matter of perception. And because what is unnatural will vary from culture to culture and person to person. So it can
Mhm.
be incredibly individualized in terms of what might meet that criteria.
Mhm.
And the second piece of criteria, which I think other guests have echoed, is beyond this idea of like otherness, is what is understood to be um, a threat. So
Mm.
it's that otherness combined with the threat either to physical safety or to social norms or to peace of mind. It has to
Mm.
present a challenge to the self in some way. Yeah.
Mm. I
So
love that. I
yeah.
love both of those aspects of it. I think because it makes sense that you said it, especially talking about your genre of horror that you really are fascinated by. And your definitions in turn kind of prove that the term monster can be used very terribly, right? Like it can be
Mm,
used in a way that does reflect what's going on in society
yeah.
culturally, and I think that's what makes it so terrifying.
Hmm.
Um, is that it varies, right?
Yeah.
There's not one distinct way of looking at it. It varies.
Yeah.
It varies. Oh, that's so good. That's so
Oh.
good, Allison. I love it.
Well,
I love
I
it.
do have to give credit to everyone else who's previously answered this question because because it's absolutely built on, other responses you've gotten from other fabulous past guests. And I did want to mention that something that has been picked up on by maybe several people, but I know Josh mentioned it, is the idea of
Okay.
like monster is tragic, like the tragic
Mm.
nature of a monster. And when
Yeah.
he mentioned the figure that I think about when I think of like understanding and perceptions of the monstrous, and especially them being tragic, like the most, he mentioned Medusa. which I don't know, I'm not a big like Greek mythology person,
Yeah.
but how she becomes a monster is an incredibly traumatic and tragic, like, and she's otherized and made monstrous for a traumatic incident that happens to her. And it's so funny, and that's also true of the Wolfman, because he Lon Chaney's character is bitten by a werewolf, and so then becomes a werewolf himself against his will. And
Right.
it, that dimension of like, you can't help what happens to you, but you have met this really really grim fate for it, is yeah, it's just it's tragic. And the monster that we talk about today is tragic as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. This idea of consent, I think,
Yeah.
can really complicate things in terms of the monster world. And consent can mean so many different things. And I think it is so terrifying. Like, I know in the show, right? Um, Almost all of the guests, we geek about this stuff. We get excited about monsters. There are monsters out there that have just saved us and saved our lives in so many ways.
Mhm.
On the adverse of that, for the same amount of guests, all of us, there are also monsters out there that break our hearts. There are monsters out there that have hurt us. There are people out there that have made us feel like monsters in the negative way.
Mhm.
And I think, again, it leads to this idea, depends on who's calling who the monster,
Right.
that the definition changes a lot, and the weight of the definition changes. And I'm so glad that you mentioned Medusa, and the Wolfman, right? Because I think a lot of people tend to forget that, not in every story, of course, but in a lot of stories, it's often brought on by an attack, by a bite,
Yeah.
non-consensual. It
Right.
is often referred to as a curse or as a
Yeah.
disease.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that you just absolutely have no control over. You also have no control over when you change every day, or whenever it is that you change. Like, there is just so much loss of control
Mhm.
in that specific entity. So I love your definition. I really do. And I, like you said, I think we're going to talk about it a lot today in
Yeah.
this specific episode.
Mhm.
Okay, so we've thrown around this word a little bit so far, but I'm curious, because we're going to be saying this word a lot.
Okay.
In your words, what is a legend, Allison?
So again, I feel like I kind of have to punt it because there's so many incredible folklorists that have already done extensive work on like the genre of legend.
Yeah.
But to put it in just the absolute most bare terms, a legend is a third person narrative that is usually told with like the understanding, or like it's purported to be true. And maybe some of the function in telling it is that its veracity can be debated, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like,
Mm-hmm.
usually it's like any genre in that it has a conventions that it follows. And usually one of the ones that it follows is that it's told in order to maybe elicit discussion on whether or not it could be true, it could not be true, or it's possible or
Yep.
plausible even, or like, or maybe it didn't happen that way, but it happened like more this way, like,
Right.
yeah, that's generally speaking what a legend is.
Perfect. Absolutely it is. Yes. Yes. And legend is so hard to define. Because as you mentioned, there's so many different ways to look at it.
Yeah.
But yes, you're absolutely right. There is a certain, I don't want to say rules or steps that like a legend has, but pretty much there are certain motifs or certain ways that the story is told, the third
Mm-hmm.
person nature of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's also this often localization, I
Oh
think,
yeah, yeah,
of
yeah.
the narrative, right? Like, it
Yeah,
happened down the street, or like
exactly.
kind of bringing you into the world of like, this could
Yeah.
happen to you.
Yeah.
um not always, sometimes, like, a moral of the story, but not often. Like that can happen.
Yeah.
I think, as you mentioned earlier, Allison, this idea of like in the 70s, 80s, like when these slasher films started to make commentary on like, oh, if you have sex outside of marriage, you're too young, right? Like you're gonna die, you're gonna get killed. And there's a very popular legend, right, with the man with the hook, that would, attack teenagers alone in their car at night.
I'm so glad you mentioned it, because we're going to get into it. Better believe we're going to get into it.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. So this idea, right, it's there's a moral code. There's this sense of good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that it can haunt you and come back, whatever the legend may be. And I guess, yes, obviously we're speaking about it through a horror lens, but legends can mean a lot of things. It's just this idea of like, they have persisted for centuries. These stories have stayed. They are transmitted between people.
Yeah.
And so I think we picked a pinnacle for this monster today.
Yes.
And I'm going to ask you this too. I was going to ask you this a little later, but I think it's pertinent that we ask it now. What is ostension, Allison?
So ostension, as best I understand it, is when used in the context of folklore, is of acting out a legend to specifically to test its veracity, to see whether or not it is real. So I guess a legend that a lot of people have heard, and of course that's another thing with legends, is that they have variants, because they change between depending on who's telling the story. And like you said, there's localization. Like it could be like something like, I know with La Llorona, it's often the case that, oh, this happened in this river here, or like, and
Right.
yeah, it happens all the time. So there's localization, and then there's like some details change depending on who is telling the story.
Right.
But I guess a legend that I've heard, and I'm sure you've heard it as well, is like, if you eat either Pop Rocks or Mentos, and then you drink a soda, that your stomach contents will explode or something.
Explode.
So but
Yeah.
So ostension would be us like eating Pop Rocks and Coke to see if it is true, if it happens.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's just like testing it. Yeah.
Quite literally.
Yeah.
It
Exactly.
really is.
Yeah.
You are acting it out to see if you will have the same outcome.
Yeah,
the same
exactly.
conclusion. It's
Yeah.
like a
science
project.
exactly. Yeah, it's like the scientific method for folklore, I guess. It's yeah.
That's literally exactly what it is.
Yeah.
And we've kind of been trained to do it ever since we were little. Like, of course, there's legends that your parents may tell you or
Sure.
something along those lines. But I think as kids growing up in schools and your friends having all of these scary things to say and legends to say, you wanted to reenact these things to see,
Yeah.
I don't know, right? Like what would happen. And so ostension is a huge part, I think, of legends.
Yeah.
It's almost, I don't want to say they're one and like the same in the sense of they always have to be one without the other, but it's rare to see one without the other, I guess you could say.
Yeah. And like, I was such a like a scaredy cat as a kid that I never ever I'm sure there are ways I engaged in ostension, but if it was like the scary legends, then I wouldn't like I can guarantee you I, didn't say Bloody Mary in the mirror, and I didn't like do the Pop Rocks. I didn't. I just
Yeah.
like just too scared. I was okay with the notion that it could be true, and I didn't want to test it for myself in case it was.
See, because you're a smart child. You were a smart child, Allison, that knew better and knew what you should not be doing, that there was a reason people were telling us these legends. No, I 100% did the Bloody Mary thing.
You did?
As a kid. I did.
Stop.
With like at our elementary school bathroom.
Yeah. And you're still here, so
I'm still here. Was it freaking scary? Yes.
yeah.
I have no idea what happened because I ran out as soon as I said her name the third time. I ran out. I was like, I'm not doing this. I don't want to see anybody. I don't want to do this. I think there is also this idea of peer pressure that goes along with it of like,
Oh yeah, that's so true.
Right? Like, I
It's
want to be
usually
so cool.
social. It's usually social, right? Like it's something you do in
Yeah,
groups with friends, for sure.
exactly. There's just so, I don't know, there's a lot of coming of age that comes
Mhm.
from, I think, partaking or not partaking in legend tripping,
Yeah.
right? And it's I don't know. I have a funny story about your specific monster, but
I can't
before we
wait to
get
hear it.
there,
Okay, okay, okay. Please do tell it though.
oh, I will. Who is the Candyman, Allison?
So, I thought you would love this. I saw an interview with Jordan Peele, who said that the
Love
Candyman
it.
is the patron saint of urban legends.
Mm,
So, but the answer to who is Candyman depends because first there was a short story which spawned 4 movies, and then, as I think you alluded to, like those movies have been spawned like folklore and legendary, not related necessarily to the movies.
right.
So that is a complicated answer, and I'm happy to give like general overviews of who Candyman is in each context, and then we can like maybe delve into specifics. Does that sound
I
good?
think that's a great way of doing it because you're right. There are many iterations of the Candyman. And so I'm curious in any that you can, right? Like, who is this character? What is this person, right?
Mm,
Like, what is their role in these
yeah.
narratives?
So, Candyman made his first appearance um,
Oof.
in a right in a Clive Barker short story from 1985. That's when it was
Yeah.
this collection was published. It was a short story called The Forbidden, and it was about and it's tragic how much we probably both, me specifically, I definitely do this, you probably do this too, I how much I identify with like lead characters who are like academics, but
Oh, yeah.
uh, the short story follows a graduate student who is based in, I believe she's based in Liverpool. I think the story takes place in Liverpool because that's Clive Barker's hometown, and so she's researching. She comes from a wealthier background and educated, and she's researching the graffiti that's found at a particular council estate.
Okay.
So like working class housing in Liverpool. I don't think the city's ever named, but I think Clive Barker has specifically mentioned that it is based on Liverpool. And in it, he mentions being really attracted to the notion of being caught on the wrong side of town, and so
Mm,
he wanted to explore this character who's caught on the wrong side of town, but she's um, doing it for a particular reason. She's driven there by her research interests.
right.
And doing her research, she encounters the legend of Candyman, who is um, a ghostly figure, who like a spectral figure who has a hook for a hand. Um,
Yep.
and it's so funny because Clive Barker specifically says he was influenced by Jan Harold Brunvand,
Oh
who
my
is a
gosh.
folklorist who he, as you well know, he his whole like career was based on like urban legends. I think he possibly even coined the term urban legends, and
Yeah.
so he wrote a series of books. I think the one that this comes from is The Vanishing Hitchhiker, and so he
Hmm.
collected urban narratives and then, or sorry, urban legends, and he
Yeah.
published these in collections. And so Clive Barker specifically reference that, like, so that's another like fun like influence of like folklore on film, but is that later it would become adapted into film, but also of
Yeah.
course for of folklore on literature, which has always been around, but
Oh, yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
yeah, but so Candyman, that's his appearance, and I haven't read the short story. I tried to find it online, I couldn't find it. But I believe he can also be summoned in the way that he is in the movies. So if you look in the mirror and say Candyman 5 times, he'll appear, and in the movies he murders you. And I'm assuming that that's the same in the. He murders whomever summons him. I'm
Right.
assuming that's the same in the short story. So there is class commentary pretty explicitly in the short story, but director Bernard Rose got the rights to the story and made Candyman in 1990. It came out in 1992, and
Okay.
he changed the location and the context of the story so that it took place in Chicago. So it follows still a graduate student, and with Candyman races, and the Candyman the film series race is an important element. So it follows a white affluent graduate student studying. It never says that she's studying folklore, but she's doing her master's thesis on urban legends.
Right. It's like, must
Right.
be.
And the community that she goes into then is Cabrini Green, which was a neighborhood that was home to a housing project of the same name, and that's located in Chicago. And for especially in like the 80s and the 90s, I think it's easy to forget now, but Cabrini Green was like nationally notorious. It became kind of like a shorthand for all the failings of American public housing because its reputation was so notorious.
Yeah.
Obviously for crime and low quality of life, and of course, the disenfranchisement of the folks who lived there. But that then became the research context. And in changing the context of where the story takes place, I believe the creators make pretty explicitly that they also wanted to comment on systemic racial injustice in this country, right?
Yep.
So the Candyman of the films, or at least the first film, is a man who existed in the late 1800s, like 1880s, 1890s, and he was the son of a man who was formerly enslaved, and
I did
he,
not know that.
yeah, oh yeah, so uh, the Candyman, he was a renowned painter and moved in, like elite society and as someone who painted portraits. And he ended up falling in love consensually with a white woman, whose father had hired him to paint her portrait, and she became pregnant. And her father rounded up a mob who effectively, like lynched him. And they put this whole story as taking place in the area that eventually would become Cabrini Green. But I'm sorry, it's difficult to talk about, even,
Oh,
like difficult to
no.
say out loud, right? So,
Yeah.
so Candyman's right hand was sawn off and replaced with a hook. And in this version of the story, there was an apiary nearby, and he was stung to death by bees.
Yep.
So that's the version of the Candyman in the films. He's played absolutely brilliantly. Anyway, the way that he's summoned again is just by saying his name 5 times in the mirror.
Right.
So that's the same. In this, I mean, and the second and the third films are not all that great.
Yeah. Yeah.
They kind of fell into like the slasher tropes of the 90s. So like the third film is it doesn't take place in Chicago. It takes place in New Orleans during Mardi Gras, which I don't know. It seems kind of like a gimmick because is there a place in America that has been more like otherized and exoticized than New Orleans, especially during
Yeah.
Mardi Gras. So,
Right.
but the second film does give him his name. Daniel Robitaille is the name of Candyman.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Tony Todd is the actor that plays Candyman, and he helped create Candyman's backstory for the films. So, um, uh, the third film takes place during Dia de los Muertos in East Los Angeles, which is another.
I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
it does. Yeah, which I
Oh,
haven't seen it, but I don't know, this troubling trend of like setting, horror films and like in contexts that have historically been otherized and completely misunderstood, especially like non-white
yeah.
contexts, is
Right.
yeah. So anyway,
Yeah.
but then in the fourth film, which is just called Candyman, is kind of a requel, so it doesn't allude really to the other two films post
Right.
1992. So it reconceptualizes Candyman as a constellation of Black men who have similarly died by racial violence. So it reworks the Candyman into Candyman is just someone different depending on who's telling the story, but
Mm,
more importantly references what Jordan Peele called the epidemic of violence on Black bodies in the United
mm,
States, just to be like reinforcing the idea that this is not simply historical, it's something that continues to happen. And in fact,
mhm.
that's dialogue lifted from the movie. Is that Candyman, there's a character, and we could talk about it more later, is that but there's a character that says Candyman is how we deal with the fact that these things keep happening, you know.
Oh, mm-hmm.
So that was a really long-winded.
It's perfect.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank
But
you so much. No, absolutely.
so we can get into specifics, or
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
anything.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I, I've only seen bits and pieces of Candyman movies. I've never actually sat down and watched a full one,
Okay.
which I've been waiting for because I love Jordan Peele with every inch of my being.
Yes.
I am just infatuated by the movies and the films that he creates.
Yeah.
Um, but there's so much to dive into, and I'm very excited to talk to you about this. And I think I'm going to try to go in like order. So, chronological order.
Yeah.
But for you kind of mentioned this a little bit. So traditionally, right, what does Candyman look like, right? You mentioned there is often a hook for a hand, right?
Mhm.
Or in some way the hand is gone, right?
Yeah.
Um, the idea of bees, right, has always been
Yeah.
a part of it in
Yeah,
some
I think
way.
that's been true for the short story as well. I'm not certain, but I think yeah.
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 Um, often than not a black gentleman, right,
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
most of the versions and the variations.
Mhm.
Is there anything else, like maybe perhaps what he is wearing, or any other iconic aspects of Candyman?
I think probably the most iconic aspect of Candyman is probably his wardrobe, because he has this big, like heavy, almost cape-like coat, and it's
Mm-hmm.
very like refined, and it's very heavy, and it's very lush in its appearance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that especially the creators of the movies were really influenced by like gothic horror and wanted to give
Mm,
Candyman like this like tragic gothic dimension. I think
right.
I think it was Tony Todd that said, all like gothic horror like comes with this like tragic nature usually. So in,
Right.
in literature and in film, and so they wanted to see that through in the film as well, especially as how Candyman was costumed. But
Right.
when he opens up his coat, you can see like an exposed like chest cavity with bees in it.
Which
Yeah.
I I do want to ask, I'm going to ask you now, because I know we're going to go into different places right now.
Yeah.
What do you think is the significance? Obviously, I know it's part of some of the story, right? The storyline of like running into beehive and things of that nature. Do you think there's any other significance for the usage of bees, like for this specific entity?
You know what? I don't. I wish I did, but I do think that
Yeah.
there's a connection in the term Candyman because of candy and honey and
Sweetness, right?
sweetness. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I think it is, but I'm not
Yeah.
certain.
I'm so curious. I
Yeah, me
mean, to me, but this is me totally going like left field, like overanalyzing it to the brim for no reason. I feel like, and it's also on the commentary Jordan Peele made and that you were talking about, this idea of legend, right? It, in the wrong hands, has destroyed, I mean, whole cultural bodies. I mean, it's so hard to explain, but like racism in and of itself in almost every story in history was birthed from a legend, if you think about it, right? These
Mhm.
ideas of telling these stories of what people think certain cultural groups are, what
Mm,
they look like, what they do, what they're capable of, and how they can hurt you,
mm,
right? And it's interesting to think about it in the context of Candyman and how the wrong words in terrible hands can go so as far as to be to do horrible things,
mhm,
right? And those words stick with these cultural groups, and it's horrible, and that's how stereotypes are birthed, as you mentioned, right? That's how many of the stereotypes of these films um, were crafted and created, right? And I think the hive mentality could very much kind of bookend this character,
mm,
right? This idea of like whatever one bee does, the other one will follow, right?
mm.
This they follow the power, they follow the person in power, they follow, right? That the one that's in charge. And I feel it could be a commentary too. And maybe that wasn't its original intention, but like this mob-like mentality of racism, of
Mm.
sexism, of otherizing groups of individuals, and how quick it happens. And I feel like that could, and again, maybe I'm thinking about it way too much, but it's possible.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's so funny that you say that. I do think whether or not it was originally a part of it or not, the filmmakers comment on it because they especially in the 2021 version when a certain character is narrating you know the police beating of a black man. He uses words like, of course, this word choice. So the screenwriting is
Yeah.
deliberate, but it's like they swarmed him, or it's just like it's something that
Yes.
they really try to make explicit.
Yeah.
And they also, in the idea of, Candyman is not just one person. It's like this idea that it encompasses, the endings of a lot of people's lives and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
the idea of there being multiple individuals who could inhabit the role of Candyman. It could be referred to as a hive.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that was included in the 2021 version. So whether or not it was explicitly a part of it, I think you're onto it, and that the filmmakers like made a explicit connection. Yeah.
It's what I mean, a powerful, powerful monster you've chosen today. I just, it's got like so many metaphors, so many stories behind the creation of that one.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And we haven't
but
even talked about like legend, like so I'm assuming you heard of Candyman through a legend, right?
I did.
Can you tell me?
But what's crazy, okay? This is very weird, and I don't know. And it's probably just like pure and simple localization of where I grew up.
Yeah.
But I grew up in a town mostly Mexican. Like that was the majority. And when I was little in my elementary school, I went to Crockett Elementary School. And that specific elementary school actually used to be a hospital for veterans at the time because there's a base like on our
Mm-hmm.
in El Paso.
Yeah.
But then, they tore it down or whatever, and then it became an elementary school. And there was definitely a lot of spooky legends like going around about anything and everything because it was such a haunting place. You
Yeah.
could tell that it was once a hospital, and wildly enough, my very first introduction to Candyman, to my knowledge, was not this character. So people would talk about Candyman, and I was like, I don't know what you all are talking about, right? Like, I was like, I've never heard of this before. Who is that? And they were like, well, Camille, when this hospital was once a thing and it housed veterans and things, a clown used to work at this hospital and used to go from like room to room trying to cheer people up and try to make them happy and right, all is well,
Yeah.
all is fine.
Yeah.
Until one day, and this is a bit triggering, but
Yeah.
one day in the legend goes that there was one person or one child or something that he could not make laugh. And so he decided to take his life at the hospital. And so now, which is weird because now the same act of ostension, legend tripping went, where it's
Uh-huh.
like stick Candyman in the bathroom 5 times, and you're going to be visited by this specific Candyman, right? And so birthed a lot of fears for me. That's 100% for sure.
Clearly. That I
Clearly stuck with me for a very long time. But ironically enough, that was the first version I had ever heard about. And it wasn't until I don't even think it was until I was like in college,
yeah.
if I'm not mistaken, that I was like, wait, like this is a completely different Candyman. Completely. Like just completely. And I don't know what that means. It's just weird. I had a very different growing up relation.
That is so incredible. That is so incredible because
Isn't that weird?
it's so far away. Like it's so interesting because it's so far away from the films, and
So far.
the only like legend versions of Candyman that I've heard have been, like maybe they haven't specified the race, but it's something similar to Bloody Mary, right? Where you
Right.
just
Right.
yeah, or like no, there are no circumstances beyond like if you say Candyman 5 times in the mirror, someone will show up, and but yeah, that
Yeah.
is absolutely fascinating that it's so localized and like and so like radically different from the films.
So different. And maybe the kids I was going to school with were just great storytellers and wanted to just pull a fast one on Camille, but like I was thrown for a loop for years. Um, did not know. Um, but it's crazy because I think if I learned about this version
Mm.
of Candyman, I think I would have felt, because it's weird, right? Like the version that I was told, strangely enough, and as we all know, I have a huge fear of clowns, but like the version I was told, there was still this idea of empathy,
Mm.
empathizing with the character of,
Wow, yeah, that's true.
right? Like
Yeah,
this, it wasn't his fault.
a tragic figure.
A tragic figure. There
Yeah,
you go.
yeah.
And it's his only goal was to make somebody laugh, and he could never do it.
Mm.
And I think if I heard the version though of this specific Candyman, right, the iconicized version, I think I would have felt empathy even more. I think there would have been this, right, like outpouring of, oh my
Mm.
gosh, like this poor person, this poor individual. Um, it's just wild. It's just wild how legends work.
It's
Very,
so
very weird.
interesting. Well, the co-write so the 2021 Candyman was co-written by Jordan Peele, who produced it, and Nia DaCosta, who directed it. And I saw an interview with Nia DaCosta where she said as a kid she had not seen the films but heard other kids talk about Candyman as, like, oh, like someone on her like he lived on her street or just down the street, or just like, oh, like kids would say like, oh, Candyman lives over there, but
Right.
nothing beyond that, like not if not the like whole like ritual of summoning him or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's really, really interesting.
It's just weird. It's a very strange. I don't know what that says about what we were going through at the time, but it's weird. It's different.
Every other
But
folklorist and folklore inclined person listening to this must be just like, oh, that's crazy. You know, it's
that's
just
so
like,
weird.
right. That there's like so like that much variation is like crazy.
Very different, right? Like very different. Um no, yeah, it's really strange. And I wanted to, pick your brain too because you mentioned this when we were initially talking about what monster you were
Yeah.
going to pick. And for people may not know, right? First of all, that folklore exists as a profession and that
Mhm.
you can study it academically. And I didn't know until I accidentally took a folklore class in undergrad. And there's a lot of complex parts of the discipline and the field in general. um, and I think you've touched on it very well in kind of the first Candyman films and things and the stories and things. And I wanted to know if you could expand a little bit more for people that just don't know the folklore field or are not aware of it. What is it that we do, and why have we had such a problematic past, I think is the best way I can ask that question.
That is such a that really gets to the heart of like why this is a monster to talk about, especially on
Yeah,
this podcast, because um, there's so many lenses through which to look and talk about Candyman. But I felt that as folklorists we'd be able to have a really interesting conversation about it. So
yeah,
I'll concentrate my efforts on the first film because the first
sure.
film does follow a white woman and is told from that perspective of a white woman. We follow her; she's our protagonist, and she goes into this black just in place in space, especially one that has been like so rampantly neglected by the system.
Right.
um, So I think what makes this film a good film to talk about folklore and folklore research is that um, the practices shown in this film show like what is essentially you know extractive field work. I don't think
Yeah.
anyone in the 90s certainly was doing field work like this. And
Mm,
so, what field work and folklore looks like is just, working within a community, conducting interviews with people, and engaging in what's called participant observation, and
yeah.
which is literally what it sounds like. You're participating in certain things that you're invited to participate in, and you're also observing just to like see what people are doing and what they're talking about when they're doing it. I think uh, usually fundamentally it's a curiosity of different ways of being.
Mm, mm-hmm.
um but part of like the genre that of cultural research that folklorists are a part of, I guess you could call it ethnography, which is this
Mm-hmm.
process of like going into community, interviewing people, doing participant observation, and then writing about it. Ethnography is obviously the term for both like the research and
Right.
the research methodologies taken as a whole, and like the genre of literature that comes from it.
Right.
Um, so we can't talk about ethnography as like a genre and as a practice without talking about its history and how the disciplines that um, inform ethnography as a practice um, were rooted in um, sometimes in racism, a lot of times in colonialism, and just
Yeah.
yeah. So the idea of like disciplines like anthropology that emerged at a time of increased colonialization and exploration of smaller cultures, like
Yeah.
like outside of one's own social group, especially like cultures perceived to be exotic.
Yeah.
So so a researcher in those contexts would obviously be going with like no invitation and like
Yes.
yeah just with for like to satisfy one's own curiosity, right? Or the curiosity of maybe a larger purpose. Maybe some people were um, funded by institutions that were part of the colonial apparatus, right? And maybe their findings were similarly used for purposes that did not advantage in any way the folks that were being written about.
Right.
So that's the historical basis of ethnography as like a genre
Yeah.
and as a like a methodology, which I think anthropologists and folklorists, especially in like the 80s, 90s, were really working to counter, because I think there was this kind of like scholarly reckoning of
Yeah.
this power imbalance. And
Right.
so there are a lot of different methodologies that developed to try and acknowledge this power imbalance and try to rectify it in certain ways. And no way is perfect,
Yeah.
but collaborative ethnography has come out of that movement. So the
Right.
idea that um, it's not just a researcher coming into a community um, and then going and writing about it without the input of that community later.
Right.
Because ethnography as a genre includes ideally both an emic and an etic perspective. So, an emic
Yeah.
perspective is the perspective of um, the insider group,
Mm-hmm.
and the etic perspective is the perspective of the outsider. So the idea that you can present both of these simultaneously will give some like fuller, bigger clarity of
Mm-hmm.
whatever you're writing about, whether or not it's like it's a particular ritual or practice or custom or whatever, or it's about a group as a whole.
Yeah.
That's the idea. But traditionally these things were the final product, whatever that product would be, would not be done in consultation with the groups that these scholars worked with.
Yeah.
And so there's a really good example of Elaine Lawless is a folklorist who has worked with particularly women of different Christian backgrounds, but like
Right.
traditional Christian backgrounds. And she had written a book that was focused primarily on one woman who she really leaned on and considered a good friend, I think, even. And had put but Lawless had put her own interpretations on things, as we because we do take stories and the things that people tell us and people's experiences, the things that they share with us, and we do a lot with that. We share it,
Yeah.
we put an interpretive lens on it, and we are free to do that, but sometimes that doesn't reflect the interests of the people that we're writing about. So what
Right.
Elaine Lawless did is that when she finished a book, she sent it to this woman who had been a really close collaborator of hers, at least in like the field research, like and this woman said, I sent a note back to Elaine Wallace. It's like, I don't recognize myself in any of this. I don't
Yeah.
see this is not how I see myself. This is not
Yeah.
how I understand the world that I move through.
Yeah.
So kudos for finishing the book, but I don't see myself represented in this. And so she did like a complete entire like overhaul of everything that she had been doing and tried
Right.
to develop a methodology that she called reciprocal ethnography,
Mm-hmm.
where she would not just keep her cards to her close to her vest and like go and write, but she would constantly pose questions about what she was thinking and her interpretive lenses to the folks that she was working with,
Yeah.
and that dialogue would then become the product, is this like synthesis between like submitting a question, posing a question or interpretation, getting feedback on it, and then that dialogue is what becomes the product.
Exactly.
And so that's not the only type of collaborative ethnography. that's out there, but it's the collaborative ethnography is just this idea that still prevails in journalism sometimes and in some academic circles. If you're too close, or if someone has too much say in the final product, then like if the source has too much say in a final product, then it's not good enough, that it could be compromised in some way. And collaborative ethnography is bringing more community involvement into the final product, and communities having more of a say in how they're represented, and
Yes.
representing, like, obviously acknowledging that no one community is going to have a single unified voice, that everyone within the community will have different, if you interview 10 people, you'll get 10 different answers on something, perhaps.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah.
there's been a push to acknowledge the power imbalance inherent within ethnography as a genre, because at the end of the day, it is the folklorist or the anthropologist who puts pen to paper, maybe.
Right.
But there have been other
Right.
ways. And I did want to mention, I did want to shout out to Josh, who has been a previous guest on the podcast, because he, for his own work, and he wrote about this. I would recommend to anyone the article that he wrote for the Kentucky Folklife magazine.
I can link that.
Yeah, do that, because he talks about these concerns very explicitly when he was filming, in the process of putting together his documentary, by Parties Unknown. And so he and another collaborator of his were obviously making a documentary on lynchings in central Kentucky.
Right.
And we're telling them, from the perspective of the community in which it happened, and along with community leaders. But they realized that this process needed to be far more collaborative and have far more say from the community
Right.
than maybe traditionally a documentary would have. And so that they experimented with different ways to make it look and seem more reflective of something the community was also content with.
Exactly.
So, yeah. And
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. I was just gonna say it is a great read. And I can put all of that information down below so people can read it, if they can watch the documentary, which is heavy, but in a beautiful way, in a way that proves, right, that history happened and we should not turn a blind eye to that. But you're right, it was so interesting to see, through his article, him and Michael Morrow, kind of the push and pull, and how they had to craft this story, and whose voice was truly being represented.
Right.
And I know Josh has done some work too on this idea of, as a documentarian, right, taking your voice out of things, and how beneficial that can be, for so many communities, because again, it really, as it sounds, it's not all about you, right?
Right.
It's not, but yes, absolutely. And I think you expressed that so beautifully and said exactly the complicated circumstances that folklorists have found themselves in, and the care that they should be handling things with, just point blank period. And I'm curious, Allison, why do you feel like Candyman is a vessel to talk about this kind of stuff?
Yeah. So I think it's a good film to talk about, with
Sure.
regards to folklore fieldwork, because it's definitely an example of fieldwork. The protagonist, Helen, in the first film, in the 1992 film, is an outsider who comes into uh, Cabrini Green and the community of Cabrini Green, from this very detached academic perspective. And the way that her fieldwork is conducted is, I don't think anyone was doing folklore fieldwork like this in the 1990s. So that's another way of just like, maybe we're like the film what is the reality in the film may not match the reality of what's been done in real life. But she does a lot of things that we're asked to empathize with her and respect her, because she goes in with this idea of like, she's really dogged and she's going to get to the bottom of something. But the way she goes about it is she turns up to this community uninvited,
Right.
and she essentially trespasses and is called out for it, actually, by someone that she encounters in the film. And yeah, but she's also incredibly dismissive of like some of the concerns of
Mm.
the residents of Cabrini Green, who tell her that there's a murder that's been perpetrated by Candyman, is what they tell her, and they express to her these concerns that
Yeah.
there'll be some repercussions on them,
Right.
and that this violence might touch them. But she dismisses the Candyman legend as something that it's just something that they tell themselves in order to cope with the trauma of their everyday living situation. And
Mm.
so that's something that is reiterated throughout the film. And so there's an article, and I can link it, but there's an
Yeah.
article about Candyman that said it so succinctly. Something to the effect of that Helen, acts as if she knows the residents of Cabrini Green and their experiences better than they do themselves, which
Hmm.
has historically been a problem with ethnography, as we've talked about. And so, but the film makes that abundantly clear, right? And she, that's ultimately, right, her like downfall, because she's wrong, right?
Yes.
Yeah, because
All the way.
she tells someone that she meets, um, Candyman isn't real. And so then Candyman appears to her later, explicitly saying, like, it's also really interesting how Candyman in these films is like an entity that perpetuates his own being by having his legend being told, and
Hmm.
takes an active agent in that, because
Hmm.
when he finally does appear to Helen, he tells her, you have diminished people's belief in me, so I must shed innocent blood in order to perpetuate my existence.
Oh.
So I know, right? It's yeah, but I yeah,
Oh.
right,
Gosh.
yeah.
What a monster.
So
Right.
yeah. Yeah, I think Tony Todd, who is obviously the actor that plays Candyman in the first three films, said something to the effect of that his spirit was so strong that it refused to die, and so this is the form that it takes in order for him to live on, right? Yeah,
However monstrous you people want to see it as,
yeah,
right? I am existing. I am
yeah,
existing and I am perpetuating that. Um like you said, unfortunately by killing innocent blood potentially.
right.
Um but it also is in this weird way proving to people like, look, so you want to paint me this way, then that's how you will die. Like that's how
Mm,
you're going to
mm-hmm,
go,
mm-hmm.
by the very words that you spewed out of your mouth. Like that's
Yeah,
then how you see me.
yeah.
That is how you will die. And it is wild. It is what, like, gosh, I want to do another thesis, and
You
I
should.
want us to collaborate both on this monster, because I have so many thoughts and questions. And
Please.
the way, just the idea of legend in itself and ostension. And I have a question for you,
Mm-hmm,
right? Um, because you're right. This creature, this person, has to be summoned, right?
mm-hmm,
There
mm-hmm.
it has to. There is a specific way that this person has to be summoned every single time. Why do you think there is this obsession? Um, and here's the crazy thing: violence against Black bodies specifically. There has been a lot of discussion about this idea. I mean, there was a portion in time, um, I mean, violence against Black bodies has always been a thing, unfortunately. Racially targeted, right? Like that, it's been horrible, and there's been a lot of discussions, with technology and things of that nature, people recording, um, said violent acts of Black bodies losing their lives brutally, and using it as a vessel to share, right? Like, look what's happening, look what's happening, look what's happening. Everybody needs to open their eyes to the racial injustice that is happening, and the complicated nature of that.
Yeah.
And I don't truly feel like super, what's the word I'm looking for? Correct in what I'm saying, because I do not live the experience. I have privilege in that way, but this idea of people becoming numb to the violence because they see it so often, it's becoming less talked about, or it's so violent, for people and other Black bodies to see over and over and over and over and over again, only to prove a point again about their existence and why they matter and why they're important and why them living and breathing and happy should also be shared, right? And there's been so much discussion about this idea of transmission and transmitting the Black experience in America, for example, and what that looks like and what that translates as. And I think there are strange parallels with this legend and with that reality, the dark reality. And I'm curious, why do you think this idea of summoning it again and again and again and again, bringing this person, this Candyman, right, over again and again and again, why do you think that is part of it? Why do you think that is part of the entire legend, a part of his existence in that way, right? Is this repetitive nature, I guess you could say.
Yeah. It's a great question, and it's something that is a perfect segue to the second film, which is, told from a black from the perspective of a black experience, because the first film is not, with the exception of Tony Todd, who obviously did a fantastic, and this first three films he did a fantastic job as Candyman, and he did have some say in the development of Candyman's backstory. The rest of the creators were not black, and it was not something born of a black experience. But
Right.
the second film absolutely is. It was complete creative control of, like I said, Jordan Peele and Nia DaCosta and other fantastic actors, and so completely born out of like the black experience in America. And so they are able to adapt Candyman into something that harkens to the fact that this is not something that's just in the past. This is something that continues to happen. And it's so chilling, because the filming wrapped in 2019. The film didn't come out until 2021, right? So obviously, the Black Lives Matter movement has been going on for well over a decade, about 15 years now, probably.
Yeah.
And with its roots going back even further.
Right.
But the idea that there's again just this constant assault on Black bodies in this country,
Yes.
and that the second Candyman should reflect that. So the idea that that
You're doing great.
mm, I'm so sorry.
Don't apologize. You're doing great. This idea you said, right? The nature this of violence being perpetuated
Yeah,
towards Black bodies in America is
yeah,
representative of that repetitive nature of that, right? Like the Candyman's existence being brought up in this
yeah,
way. You can only summon him in this specific way.
mm,
Talked about in this specific way, right? Like there is a rhyme or reason almost
yeah,
in the way his existence has been written.
yeah.
I guess,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. And I think the especially the ritual of saying the name was something that the creators like the creators of the 2021 film did beautifully, because the way it's used in the film is absolutely a callback to the Black Lives Matter movement and the
Yes.
slogan of "Say their names." because
Yes. Yes.
that's something that they make really quite explicit in the film, is that the power in naming, and the power in naming and remembrance, um, and especially in telling the story, in telling their stories, um, and the final, not to, it doesn't give away anything about the film, but the final the final line in the film is said by Candyman, and it is tell everyone, right? Because in this way he is perpetuated by the telling of his story, but it also
Right.
does harken back to this idea of like, while this violence does happen all the time, don't be complicit. It can't be normalized, as you
It
said
can't be.
earlier. Yeah.
Right.
Um, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
I'm so glad you chose Candyman. I can't tell you enough. I can't tell you enough. Um okay, why, as if this conversation isn't proof enough. Um Allison, why do you think Candyman, as a film figure, as a literary figure, as a movement, right? Why is Candyman and Candyman's existence so necessary?
I think he, at least in the film versions, exists as a haunting testament to racial violence in this country. And they, like I said earlier, there's a line in the film, in the second film, from 2021, that that a character says, Candyman is how we deal with the fact that these things happen. And it's the idea of like talking about, this perpetuation of racial violence,
Right.
is, maybe not something that, an easy conversation, but it's easier to point out, through horror, through the idea of horror. Yeah, through a horror
Well
film.
said. Well said. Absolutely.
Mm.
Oh, absolutely. There's just so many things you can learn from just listening to that story once.
Mm.
So many things. So many questions can be asked. Like it's quite a story.
Mm.
Okay. Do you think Candyman is scary then?
I think, the idea of like someone who can be summoned, and has the capacity to inflict violence, is, that's absolutely, definitely scary. But I think, and other people have touched on this, this is not my original idea,
Yeah.
and it's the same with the other like tragic monsters that we've talked about before, is that their monstrosity is not the result of their own doing. It's the tragic monster is someone who these things happen to and are made monstrous because of this sort of like trauma. And so
Yeah.
so what is monstrous is the circumstances by which Candyman has taken his form, right? um
Yeah.
yeah, I think broad consensus is that's the case.
Yeah. Well said. Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you. Mm-hmm. In the same vein, perhaps you have answered this already similarly, but is Candyman a monster?
I'll say yes, and other people have said yes. Uh he is a monster, just, despite this, tragic backstory.
Yeah.
But I do want to be clear that there have been critiques of especially the first Candyman, because I don't think we've talked about it fully, but
Yeah.
obviously we've talked about the idea that it is told from the perspective of a white woman, and there's been a critique by lots and lots of people, that it's even kind of a celebration of white womanhood in a way. And I definitely agree with that assessment. But it's like, it's sort of hinted at in the first film that Helen, the protagonist, is sort of the reincarnation of Candyman's lover. Yeah,
Oh.
from his backstory. That's sort of the idea. So
Whoa.
he does sort of pursue her throughout the film in a way that is romantic, and that was very explicit in the creator's vision. But so this idea of like an interracial relationship as something that is monstrous um, is obviously not what the creators intended, but it's what critics have, pointed out, that the reason he was, became the monster that he is was because of his consensual interracial relationship. Film scholar Robin R. Means Coleman does offer this critique of Candyman, and its, especially in its perspective as, privileging the experience of a white woman throughout the film. And she does critique it also for its, premise of like this black monster is pursuing this white woman, which is um, a particularly, you know, it's a quite a racist motif, has been in the
Yes.
past.
Yes.
So she puts in her book Horror Noir, which is excellent. So she puts Candyman, Dr. Robin R. Means Coleman puts Candyman in dialogue, or the 1991 film in dialogue with The Birth of a Nation, which is an 1915 film about a mythologized valorization of the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. And so, especially there's this strong racist motif of a white woman being pursued by a black man. And Dr. Coleman also includes King Kong in this, in the idea of that, like, maybe King Kong is a metaphor for blackness. And King Kong as a character is constantly pursuing a white woman.
Yeah.
So that is certainly, by the time, like the standards of the time in which these films came out, this would absolutely be perceived as monstrous, this pursuance of a, like, this black man pursuing a white woman. And so Dr. Coleman, she like makes explicit that this is imagery that has, a pertinent history in film, in American film. And as much as, the 1991 film does not demonize the interracial nature of the relationship, and as much as we would not want to, we do not believe that any longer. She does feel like it is a necessary history to bring up. But yeah. And the producer, one of the producers on the 1992 film, even said, we acknowledge that we acknowledge Birth of a Nation and films like it, and acknowledge that they were working with racially charged imagery, but did not want to have this, like, we're not in at all in communicating the same meaning to it.
Right.
Yeah. But on the other hand, and it is, as we've said, the film is told from a white woman's perspective, but it is, it does certainly call attention to structural racism in a lot of different ways.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But so the question of whether or not Candyman is a monster, a lot of people do those critiques, taking those critiques, a lot of other people do, see him as like a figure in the horror pantheon, like one of the first, black, like like horror icons, I guess. Like
Yes.
one of the first black monsters. Obviously, there have been some before,
Of course, yes.
but
Yes.
yeah, like the blaxploitation film Blackula. That's
Mm-hmm.
what it did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there have been several other films, but Jordan Peele cites Candyman, the 1992 version, as a huge influence on him. And he said, I think if I remember correctly, he said, black horror audience, we love Freddy and we love Jason and we love all these, like, this pantheon of like horror, like monster icons. And he said to him, like, what the 1992 film represented was that we also had a place in that pantheon, right? That we had that representation. So yeah, there's the like the whole point of this podcast, right, is that, like, the monster means something different to everyone, right? And
Oh
so
yeah.
while
Yeah.
there is this very legitimate critique of the Candyman, the first film, it's just, there's also like a lot of people do find the representation in that, right?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
And the power, I think, in like you mentioned with Jordan Peele and how they were talking about this idea of say their names,
Yeah.
right? The power in that
Yeah.
is so transformative. And you're right. I think there are a lot of marginalized groups that have been marginalized by society. I think there are otherized groups that just find solace in being
Mm-hmm.
powerful and being represented.
Mm-hmm.
It's weird, even if the monster, quote unquote, dies at the end.
Right.
At least their name was said.
Mm.
And it's weird how people, it's not weird actually, but people relate to that
Mm-hmm.
so deeply.
Yeah.
I think you expressed that beautifully. You're right. Again, it's the same idea of your monster definition,
Mm-hmm.
right? This tragic backstory, yes. This otherized nature, yes. This unnatural thing that often that label is put upon them by other people.
Right.
I don't know. There's so many different ways that Candyman has been deemed monstrous,
Mm.
and also as in ways that he hasn't. That I think is very powerful either way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, in case this 2 hours wasn't enough proof, right, of how passionate you are about this specific genre of horror, Allison, why do you think talking about monsters, exploring monster stories, right, like why is it so important? Why is it so necessary to talk about monsters?
Mm. I do think that as we've been saying throughout this episode, and as you have said throughout other episodes, throughout the entirety of the run of this podcast, it's just that it is a brilliant way to communicate certain ideas. And I things that maybe be more difficult to talk about, using monsters as a metaphor, is easier, right? Or maybe like it could even slip under the radar. Like someone goes in to see a movie thinking it'll be one thing, but they come out with, thinking about something, maybe not
Yeah.
even a change perspective, but like
Mm-hmm.
introduced to an idea. Or
Yes.
yeah. So like, and I do think that horror in particular is a great vehicle for that. I do think that we're living, fortunately, at a time where horror film it's gotten a lot more serious attention. There have always been like academics who've been interested in it, but I do think that
Sure.
the conversations around horror are, especially horror films, are starting to be taken more seriously. And that's a lot in part to creators like Jordan Peele, whose work we keep referencing throughout this entire podcast.
Yes.
But
Yes.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But when I saw an interview with several of the creators with a 1992 Candyman, And it was either the director Bernard Rose or one of the producers who said, like, no one's going to pay attention to like racial commentary and like in like well, maybe racial commentary in a horror movie might fly further under the radar than it will in any other type of movie, right? Because people just use it as just being a horror movie. It's just a horror flick. I would certainly think that attitudes have changed now, but like there's a way that these ideas can be communicated, and this like maybe horror is and monsters are the way to at least have an entry into the conversation.
They're amazing vehicles.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely.
So much so. And I think you're right. Absolutely. Same. I agree. Okay. Very last question of this episode. And I'm very interested to see what you would say. So you're just chilling, right? Maybe just relaxing in your home. And I guess in this case, it wouldn't be a knock on the door. In this case, it would be you're going to the bathroom and somebody happens to appear in your mirror, and that happens to be Candyman, right? What would you do? What would you say? How would you react?
Yeah, I would think I did something wrong. I think I'd say, yeah, that would be my initial reaction. But if he let me live long enough,
Right.
probably ask him his side of the story, right? For someone whose story, and they depict this beautifully in the films, at least, is like someone who lives through stories told by other people and with the imaginations and perspectives of the other people who are telling it, which is so context dependent. Be interesting to hear him tell his own story, right? Yeah.
This episode of Floaties for Krakens was written and recorded by me, Camille Maria Acosta. A monstrous thank you to Alice and Kate for such a powerful interview. A big thank you to Michael Kosman for producing a stellar episode, and a huge thank you to Natalie Hedberg for designing such a phenomenal logo. And music for the show was also written and produced by me, with a special appearance by my tata, Toby Acosta. Thank you all so much for tuning into today's show. It means the world to me. If you have questions or curiosities about the research or media referenced in today's episode, everything will hopefully be in the description box. And you can find us on our website and our socials, links in the description as well. Anyway, thanks again for being here, everyone. And just a reminder, it's okay to be afraid of the monster, but it's also okay to love the heck out of it too. Keep being monstrous and keep shining bright.